jibber jab, bamboozle, nuka noozle, bippity bop, she-call. You jibber jab, bamboozle, nuka noozle, bippity bop, she-call. I mean, you keep on talking, but you don't know where to turn.
Welcome to the weekend. I'm Jon Caldara, president of the Independence Institute. You're watching Independent Thinking. Colorado has what's known as the initiative and referendum process, meaning you and I can put something on the ballot and try to change government. I kind of like it. A lot of people really hate it. And there's a guy who's been on, well, one side of it in many, many states and beaten up by Paul Jacob. You run an organization called Citizens in Charge. What does Citizens in Charge do?
Our goal is to protect the initiative process where we have it. We have it in 24 states. Most cities and counties throughout the country have it. We'd like to see that protected, expanded, made easier for citizens to use. We'd also like to see it expanded to the 26 states that don't have any initiative process.
All right, let's explain. Initiative process means what exactly?
It's where a citizen can put an issue, an idea that a citizen has to reform government, to make things work better. You write it up as a law. You go collect the signatures necessary to put it on the ballot. In some states, that's a tough task. In some states, it's an almost impossible task to get those signatures. But you put it on the ballot, you campaign, people debate it, and the people get to decide. And that's really the thrust.
So the idea with the initiative is it is closer to direct democracy, that the citizens come up and say, we want this change to our local government, our state government, our city government, whatever, and basically do an end around the elected politicians. And this can only, because of that, there are a few things that have happened here in Colorado that would never be passed. People say, why do you need the initiative process? We have term limits, for instance, here in Colorado. No majority of politicians would ever term limit themselves. We have a taxpayer bill of rights which says if you're going to raise taxes, you need to ask first. Politicians wouldn't want to give up that right. So if it were not for the citizens initiative, those things wouldn't happen.
Bingo. I mean, that's exactly right. You have to have this process, I think, if you're going to get the kind of reforms that matter. Term limits, forget about it. If you didn't have the initiative process, you wouldn't have term limits. I worked for over a decade for U.S. term limits, and that's really where I woke up to how important a tool this is for citizens to have, not only for term limits, but like you mentioned, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights is something that politicians are not going to pass themselves. And it's the kind of thing where oftentimes political people will say, well, gee, is it good for me or bad for me? Do I like what the legislature is going to do more than I like what the people are going to do? And they'll game it that way. I support the initiative because I want this particular initiative. The average person, though, the average voter, loves the initiative process because they're not looking to do one thing or another or block one thing or another. They want the options, the choices that come from having a process where politicians can't bottle it all up. And when you look at all kinds of issues, eminent domain reform, we've seen in a lot of states after the Kelo decision where the government basically said that yes, indeed, your local government can take your property and hand it to a developer because they'll get more tax money and there's nothing you can do about it. The country was outraged. 90% plus in polls said this is wrong. But a lot of legislatures then went to fix the problem and they put a Band-Aid on it. In fact, it wasn't even a Band-Aid. It was a fake fix.
It's those same politicians who have then the power to take people's property and put it to a different use. They're not wanting to give up that power. So the initiative process helps keep politicians' zealousness in check. We see it with Tabor, we see it with term limits, see it with eminent domain, even initiatives that I dislike, such as Amendment 23, which says you will put this much money into educational spending, came through the initiative process. Right. Politicians wouldn't do that. All right.
And you don't have to like them or you know, I don't like all the initiatives that pass, but we have to have a process whereby citizens can do the things that they want done in government. And we call it direct democracy sometimes. I don't like that term because it's not a very direct thing. It's a difficult process. You have to collect signatures. You have to convince other voters to go along with it. There's a long period of debate. Usually an initiative is placed on the ballot and you have many months to debate the issue. Voters make a decision, but of course, then the courts can get involved. So it's not as if the voters can willy-nilly change the law without there being a lot of public comment, and frankly, of course, without the voters saying this is what we want.
Would you call it a safety valve?
I see it, yes, I think you could. We have a system of checks and balances, but I think most people who look at government would recognize we're not getting the check and balance system that we'd like to get. The legislative branch is not checking the executive the way we'd like them to. The courts are not checking either branch as effectively as we'd like. To me, the initiative process is the one vibrant, real check that voters still have in our system of so-called checks and balances.
All right, let's get to some of the nitty-gritty here and why a lot of people oppose the initiative and referendum process, the idea that citizens can put something on the ballot and change governmental policies, change the law. Here in Colorado, we can even change the state constitution. In fact, our state constitution, many people argue, is too large, too unwieldy, thanks to the initiative process, that we have these clauses and amendments to the Constitution that might run counter to each other. We've got an amendment saying that you need to spend more in education every year, even if there's no money. We've got the Taxpayer Bill of Rights that says you can't have more money unless you ask. These sometimes are in conflict. Also, we have things in the Constitution that aren't constitutional. We have a constitutional ban on trapping bears in Colorado. Now, this might be a very good law, but the difference between the Constitution and statutory change is that the Constitution cannot be changed without a vote of the people. Statutory changes can happen either by a vote of the people or by legislators. So if bear hunting was in the state statute and the Department of Wildlife said, listen, you can't hunt bears now, and now we've got an epidemic, we've got bears driving cars down C-470, the state legislature could change it. Now you'd have to run a complete statewide campaign to fix something that was put in the Constitution. Quite simply, by getting amateurs involved in the very delicate process of policymaking, you clutter up the Constitution, you clutter up the law books, and a lot of those messes you can't get out of. Therefore, we shouldn't have this initiative process because of that clutter.
Well, the professionals need to realize they work for the amateurs. The amateurs, the voters, are the boss. And that's why the initiative process is so important, because without it, the professionals, our servants, would make policy without taking into account what the people want. Now, in Colorado, you had Referendum O on the ballot last November, and it was an attempt to fix the one problem I see in Colorado's initiative process. Not that there might not be other small things that could be fixed, but for the most part, the one thing you have in Colorado is the same requirement to put a constitutional amendment on the ballot as you have for a statute. So why would someone who wants to put something into law choose to go to a statute when for the same cost and trouble they can put it in as an amendment? And the real advantage of it being an amendment is they don't have to worry about special interest in politicians in the legislature ripping it up and throwing it in the trash can, 2 months after the election is held. So part of the problem is a political culture that has become so divorced from the average voter and citizen that they don't pay attention, that they don't listen to the boss. But the other problem is fixing that, and the way to fix the similarity between the process for a statute and an amendment, the same threshold, is to lower the threshold for a statute. What Referendum O did was to raise the threshold for an amendment. It did lower it for a statute, but it should not be raised for an amendment. And the worst thing that Amendment O did was to shorten the time period for people to collect signatures. And we've seen this happen. As one reason my group, Citizens in Charge, we came out in opposition to Referendum O largely because of the reduced time period. We've seen it happen in Missouri, in Florida, where they've lowered the time period, they've moved the deadline back so that petitioners can't work in the summer months, where it's light later, volunteers can go out after work and collect signatures at the ball game or what have you, and it's made a real difference. Florida's gone from having maybe 5 or 6 initiatives on the ballot in a given cycle to averaging 1 initiative on the ballot.